Hi, it's Andrea. So today is September 19th, 2015, and it's getting serious now. We are starting our stimulation today. We're going to be giving me shots to start getting those eggs to grow so that we can get them out in about a week and a half. So I'm going to talk about hormones because I want you guys to know how this whole process is going to work. So I'm going to be talking about the hormones that are involved in ovulation, getting the egg ready to go, getting the uterus ready for an embryo. And I'm going to talk first about how that works normally, just in your normal cycle, and then I'm going to talk about what we're going to be doing with my hormones that's going to be a little bit different with in vitro. So there's 4 main hormones that we're going to be talking about, and probably you already know about some of these, and especially if you have been reading my blog, then you already have heard a lot of these. So the first one is called FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and that's the hormone that we need to get the eggs growing, to make sure that they're maturing in order to be ovulating later down the road. So that's what the FSH is in charge of. They're getting the eggs prepped. Then we have what's called LH, or luteinizing hormone. And what that does, it's a very specific hormone that tells the egg to release. So just that one hormone has that one job to get that egg to release out of the ovary. So it's like, hey, open the door, get out of there. Then you have the 2 hormones that are in charge of getting your uterus ready. And I'm sure you've heard of these. There's estrogen and there's progesterone. And so estrogen helps to build up the lining of your uterus. So that's getting your uterus prepared for that baby. The progesterone is more about getting the right enzymes, hormones, nutrients in there, in that lining that can have it be healthy and ready for that embryo. So that's why it's called progesterone. It's progestation. It's making sure that that uterus is healthy where it needs to be welcoming for that embryo. So those are the 4 main hormones that we're going to be talking about. So I made these little diagrams for you guys to help and explain this cycle, and it's really fascinating how it all works together and they communicate. So of course it's a cycle, so we have to start somewhere, and we're going to start where our levels are low on our progesterone and our estrogen. Those are both at a low level, and when those are low, so if all the hormones are hanging out in a room, you can imagine that progesterone and estrogen right now, they're just taking a nap in the corner. They're there, but they're not doing a whole lot. So the FSH, that's when it gets its cue. It says, okay, estrogen and progesterone, they're not doing much. That's my cue to come on stage. So the FSH from our pituitary gland, it starts coming out. It says, we need to get these eggs ready to go. So the FSH tells the eggs to grow. These aren't olives, they're eggs. So this is our ovary, and these are our eggs. Remember that the eggs are encased in a follicle. So a follicle is basically like a shell for the egg. So here's the follicle, and the egg is inside. So it takes about 2 weeks for the FSH to work its magic on the eggs and to get them to grow. And so they start maturing, they start growing. Now this is what's really fascinating, is that the follicles, as they start growing, they actually produce estrogen as they start growing, these follicles. So the growing egg is saying to the uterus, you need to get ready for a baby because I'm about to release an egg here and we need to be prepared. So the eggs themselves produce the estrogen as they grow. So the growing follicles produce estrogen. So the estrogen levels are getting higher and higher as these eggs grow bigger and bigger. So when there's a high level of estrogen, and when it reaches a certain point, then the LH kicks in, the luteinizing hormone. So the LH takes its cue from the estrogen levels, and when they reach a certain point, the LH says, oh my goodness, we must have an egg that's really on fire, that's producing all this estrogen. So we need to get that baby out of there. So the LH triggers, and that triggers the egg to release. So here's our egg. He's getting freed because the trigger came in, the LH, and said, and opened that door and told that egg to get out of there. So then you have ovulation. So So these are the main hormones that happen with ovulation. You have FSH, tell the eggs to grow. You have the eggs telling the uterus to get ready by producing estrogen. And then that high level of estrogen, about 2 weeks into your cycle, produces the LH that triggers the egg to release. So it's this perfectly choreographed dance between the hormones, and they all take their cues from each other based on the levels that they do. So of course there's another side to this, because what about when after the egg releases? It gets even better, how fascinating this is. So here's our ovary. The egg releases and it goes into the fallopian tube, and it only has 24 hours to be, what can I think of the word? To be fertilized. 24 hours. So that's really amazing that every month we've got a 24-hour period for that egg to be fertilized and to have a baby. So it releases, and this follicle actually turns into this other structure called a corpus luteum. And this other structure keeps on doing a job. So before it was releasing as a follicle estrogen, now its job is to produce progesterone. So now it has a different job. It's sending that progesterone over to the uterus and saying, okay, we've got the lining built up. Now we need to get this thing healthy and nutrient rich and ready for that embryo, because we want it to be as welcoming as possible. So that corpus luteum, the post follicle, stays on board to do this job. I find that totally fascinating, that this follicle is still doing something in the ovary even after it releases its egg, and that's where progesterone comes from. So that builds up, and hopefully along the way we have the egg that comes down, meets up with the sperm, usually in the fallopian tube, and we have our conception. So then it comes down. This actually usually takes about a week or so for the egg, the embryo at this point, to come down and attach to the uterine lining, the uterine wall. So the embryo implants here. So we have conception and impregnation. So if we have that embryo implant, then the cells surrounding that embryo on the uterine lining are going to produce what's called HCG, which you've probably heard before as well. So the HCG is our little signal saying, wow, we actually have an embryo in here. We need to take care of this embryo and keep on going. So the HCG, what its chore is to send a signal to the corpus luteum to stay on board. So it tells the corpus luteum to keep producing progesterone, because it's important for us to keep this lining nutrient rich and healthy, because now we've got a baby to take care of in there. And so normally what would happen is you wouldn't have this HCG. If you didn't get pregnant, then the HCG would never happen because there's no embryo stimulating that. And what would happen is after about 2 weeks, that corpus luteum would say, okay, well, there's no baby on board here. I'm out. I'm gone. I'm done. I don't need to keep doing my chore of progesterone. So what happens? Your progesterone levels go down, your estrogen levels go down, and then your uterine lining isn't getting those signals anymore. So you shed it, you have your period. That's what happens. So that's why this HCG is so important, because without that, that corpus luteum is automatically going to shut down and say, okay, well, I'm done. So we need that to keep that corpus luteum going, to keep that progesterone, because that progesterone is so critical in having a healthy pregnancy and healthy baby. So it stays on board until eventually the baby and the embryo starts producing enough of its progesterone. So those are two really important levels that we read in pregnancy. Our HCG will keep going higher and higher and keep on stimulating that corpus luteum. So that's what we usually check when we're doing a pregnancy test, is the HCG levels. That'll let us know that we're pregnant. And then the progesterone levels are also important. We want to make sure that we're getting enough of that so that we have a healthy uterus. So fascinating how this all happens. And then of course, normally your estrogen level go down, your progesterone levels go down, and you have your cycle. So at the beginning of your cycle, when you're having your period and your levels are low, that's when we start all over again. The FSH goes, okay, we don't have a baby here, so time for me to come on board and start stimulating us to grow another egg and get that ready to go. So what's going to be different with me? What are we going to be doing differently? Well, I was doing birth control before, which fakes your body into thinking that you're pregnant, so I don't have anything going on with my ovaries. And because you're giving yourself progesterone and estrogen. So there's no FSH going on. Your eggs are not doing anything. So now my ovaries are all quiet. There's nothing happening. We just have the eggs sitting there ready to go. So normally, of course, you have the FSH stimulating the egg growth. But of course, on a normal cycle, we only want one. We only want one of those eggs to be released at the end and to get that FSH to grow. But with in vitro, we want as many eggs as we can get because, of course, this is costing a lot of money and we want to be able to make as many babies as we can, within reason, of course. So, and now I'm at the start of my cycle, and so today I'm going to be giving myself FSH shots. And so I couldn't find out how much you have normally on a regular cycle, but I'm going to be giving myself 300 units. And it's a little bit less than I had in my first cycle because I had like 450. But my doctor, who's a different doctor, he told me that they found that usually after about 300, it's pretty saturated at that point. It doesn't do much good to go any higher than that. So we're going to be stimulating my ovaries and the eggs to just grow like crazy. And we're going to be doing that over the next 10 days. So we're going to be doing blood work, we're going to be doing ultrasounds, we're going to be keeping an eye on it to see how this is going and if we need to make any adjustments along the way. Because of course it can be a little bit dangerous because you don't want to hyperstimulate your ovaries. You can actually end up being hospitalized and have things go not too well for you if that happens. That's about a 1% chance. It does happen, but you need to be careful. So, of course, if these are all producing estrogen too. So I got that lining building up just as a result of all this FSH that I'm giving myself and all of the estrogen that's being produced by the eggs. Now, of course, you would think, well, if your estrogen's going through the roof, then that LH might kick in and you might release all these eggs. Yeah, we don't want that. We don't want all our eggs to be released. That would be scary. So I actually am going to be giving myself a shot to suppress that LH and make sure it says, no, we need to stay in the ovary. We don't want to be going anywhere. So I'm going to be taking FSH. I'm going to be taking a shot to make sure I don't release the LH. Then after we do the egg retrieval, which is where we get the eggs out of my ovaries, and then they'll be fertilized. And after about 5 days, they'll put 1 or 2 of those embryos back in. So of course, it's still important for me to have a really nutrient-rich lining. Now, you would think with all these corpus luteums hanging out after the egg retrieval that I'm probably okay on progesterone. But they just want to make extra sure that my lining is good. So I do give myself progesterone shots after the egg retrieval because that's just so critical in having a healthy environment for that embryo to implant. So I will also be giving myself the progesterone shots as part of this whole process. Then, of course, like any other pregnancy moment, you're going to have that time where you're going to be checking your HCG levels. That will let you know as a blood test whether or not it worked. And you'll want to see that progress more and more and make sure that the baby's healthy and growing. So that's what we're hoping for, is another little miracle like Gavin. So I know that that was a lot of information, and I hope that you were able to follow along. I just think that it's amazing how our hormones all communicate with each other. They all have their specific jobs, and we have this perfectly orchestrated cycle. And the FSH takes its cue from the estrogen and progesterone, and the LH takes its cue from the estrogen. It's just all so perfectly organized. And it's like if one little thing went wrong, we would end up with 10 eggs every month instead of 1, or we would never ovulate, or our lining wouldn't be good. There's just all these factors that go in, and I just think it's amazing. So it's something that I really appreciate about our bodies and how they work, and just blows my mind. And that this is just one little part of our body, because there's all these processes happening all the time in all these other different ways in our body that are so perfectly orchestrated. So that's all about hormones. That's how women, your cycle works every month. And that's what we're going to be doing with me over these next week and a half or 2 weeks or so. So stay tuned.